There was once a day that I would pray for you. I'd go and misbehave just so you'd notice too. Sneaking looks up and down from across the room.
Learn English through stories. True crime short story. Dive into this captivating tale. Can you figure out who the killer is? Unravel the mystery as you go along. Why? Because it's not just a story, it's a challenge for your mind and a great way to improve your English.
Shadows in the Mist. Prologue. The coastal town of Haven's Edge was known for its picturesque landscapes, friendly residents, and quiet streets. But beneath the calm surface, something dark lurked, a shadow that moved through the misty nights, claiming lives and leaving the town in fear. The women of Haven's Edge were dying, and the killer was nowhere to be found. Chapter 1: A Dark Discovery. Detective Evelyn Evie Blackwood was a seasoned investigator, known for her sharp mind and relentless drive. When the body of a young woman was discovered near the rocky cliffs, her sense of unease grew. The woman, identified as Sophie Miller, had been missing for 3 days. The cause of death: strangulation. Evie stared at the crime scene, the wind whipping through her dark hair. The cliffs, with the crashing waves below, made for a haunting backdrop. She could feel the presence of someone watching, a shiver running down her spine. "Another one," murmured Detective Luke Hayes, Evie's partner and close friend. His voice was low, almost defeated. Evie nodded, her gaze fixed on the pale, lifeless face of Sophie. This was the 3rd victim in 6 months. All women. All young. All strangled. "This isn't just another case, Luke," Evie said, her voice determined. "This is the work of a serial killer." Chapter 2: The Hunt Begins. Haven's Edge had never seen anything like this. The small-town police department was ill-equipped to handle a serial killer, but Evie and Luke were determined to bring the murderer to justice. The town was on edge. Women were afraid to walk alone, businesses closed earlier than usual, and whispers of a ghost who preyed on the innocent spread like wildfire. The media had dubbed the killer the Mistwalker, a fitting name for someone who seemed to vanish without a trace. Evie and Luke pored over the evidence, the patterns, the victim profiles. All 3 victims had been in their early 20s, brunette, and lived alone. They had no apparent connections to one another, no common places they frequented, no shared acquaintances. The killer was methodical, careful. One night, after a long day of fruitless investigation, Luke invited Evie to grab a drink at the local pub. The place was almost empty, the usual lively atmosphere replaced with a tense silence. "You know, we could use a break," Luke said, sliding a glass of whiskey toward Evie. "We've been at this for weeks." Evie smiled faintly, appreciating the gesture. "I can't stop thinking about it, Luke. Every time I close my eyes, I see their faces." He reached across the table, his hand brushing hers. "We're going to find him, Evie. Together." There was something in his voice, a warmth that made Evie look up and meet his eyes. For a moment, the weight of the case lifted, replaced by the unspoken connection between them. But before she could say anything, her phone buzzed. Another body had been found. Chapter 3: A New Lead. The latest victim, Emma Caldwell, was discovered in a wooded area on the outskirts of town. Like the others, she had been strangled, her body left in a position that suggested the killer had taken his time. But this time, there was something different. "What's that?" Luke asked, pointing to a small object in the victim's hand. Evie carefully pried the fingers open, revealing a delicate silver necklace. It was old, with a small, engraved locket. Inside was a photograph of a young woman, her features strikingly similar to the victim's. "This could be a breakthrough," Evie said, her mind racing. "If we can trace this necklace, we might find our killer." They took the necklace to an antique dealer in town, who recognized the piece immediately. "This belonged to Eleanor Winters," the dealer said, his voice tinged with sadness. "She was a beautiful young woman who died tragically about 20 years ago. Her family never recovered from the loss." "How did she die?" Luke asked. The dealer hesitated. "She was found dead in her home. It was ruled a suicide, but there were always rumors." "Rumors?" Evie pressed. "That she was murdered. But there was never any proof. Her death was shrouded in mystery." Evie and Luke exchanged a glance. Could this be connected to their case? Had someone killed Eleanor Winters and was now targeting women who resembled her? Chapter 4: Ghosts of the Past. Evie and Luke delved into the history of Eleanor Winters, searching for any connection to their victims. They learned that Eleanor had been engaged to a man named Richard Thompson, a wealthy businessman who had left Haven's Edge shortly after her death. He had never returned, and his whereabouts were unknown. But the more they dug, the more they realized that Eleanor's death had affected many in the town. Old wounds were reopened, and they began to suspect that the killer might be someone who had known Eleanor, or had been obsessed with her. One night, as Evie sat alone in her apartment, she received an anonymous letter. The handwriting was elegant, almost old-fashioned, and the message sent chills down her spine. She was the first, but not the last. "I will not stop until they all pay." Evie knew this was from the killer. He was taunting her, daring her to catch him. But there was something else in the letter, something that made her feel that the killer was watching her, that he knew more about her than she was comfortable with. She decided not to tell Luke about the letter, fearing that he would worry about her safety. But the next day, as they continued their investigation, Luke could sense something was off. "Evie, are you okay?" he asked, his concern evident. She forced a smile. "I'm fine, Luke. Just tired." But Luke wasn't convinced. He had always been protective of Evie, and now, with the killer seemingly getting bolder, his protective instincts were on high alert. Chapter 5: The Trap. As the days passed, Evie and Luke began to close in on their suspect. They had traced Richard Thompson to a small town several hours away, where he had been living under a different name. They planned to confront him, but before they could, another body was found, this time, in the heart of Haven's Edge. The victim was Karen Thompson, Richard's younger sister. Her death was a message, a clear warning that the killer was always one step ahead. Evie was shaken. The killer was escalating, and she feared that anyone connected to the case was in danger. But she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she was missing, a crucial piece of the puzzle that had yet to reveal itself. That night, Evie decided to visit Eleanor Winters' old house, which had been abandoned since her death. The house was dilapidated, overgrown with weeds, and the air inside was thick with the scent of decay. As she explored the rooms, she felt a strange sense of familiarity, as if she had been there before. And then she saw it, a photograph of Eleanor, wearing the same necklace that had been found on Emma Caldwell. Suddenly, Evie heard a noise behind her. She spun around, her heart racing, but there was no one there. Just shadows in the mist. She left the house, more determined than ever to catch the killer. But as she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Chapter 6: The Final Revelation. With Richard Thompson in custody, Evie and Luke felt they were close to solving the case. But something didn't add up. Richard had an alibi for 2 of the murders, and he seemed genuinely shocked to learn about his sister's death. As they interrogated Richard, Evie noticed that he kept glancing at Luke, a strange look in his eyes. "What is it?" Evie asked, her voice sharp. Richard hesitated, then said, "He looks just like him." "Like who?" Luke demanded. "Eleanor's lover, Richard said quietly. The man she was seeing before she died. He was the reason I left Haven's Edge. I couldn't stand the sight of him, knowing he had taken her from me. Evie felt a chill run down her spine. She turned to Luke, who was staring at Richard with a mixture of confusion and anger. I don't know what you're talking about, Luke said. I've never met Eleanor Winters. But Richard was adamant. You may not remember, but I do. He was your father, wasn't he? He was the man she was going to leave me for. Evie felt the pieces falling into place. Luke's father, a man he had barely known, had been involved with Eleanor Winters. And now, someone was killing women who resembled her. But who? Chapter 7, The Unmasking. Evie couldn't shake the feeling that the answer was right in front of her. She spent the next few days going through old case files, trying to find a connection between the victims, Eleanor Winters, and Luke's father. And then she found it, a newspaper clipping from 20 years ago. It was an article about Eleanor's death, but what caught her eye was a photograph of the funeral. Among the mourners was a man who looked strikingly like Luke. But it wasn't Luke. It was his uncle, Daniel Hayes. Daniel had been a drifter in and out of Haven's Edge for most of his life. According to the files, he had been obsessed with Eleanor even before she met Richard. He was known to have a volatile temper and had disappeared shortly after Eleanor's death, only to resurface years later. Evie felt her heart pound in her chest as the truth became clear. Daniel had been in love with Eleanor, and when she chose Richard over him, it must have broken something inside him. He couldn't have her, so he killed her. And now, all these years later, he was killing women who reminded him of her, women who looked like Eleanor. Evie knew she had to act fast. She called Luke, but he didn't answer. Panic set in as she realized that Luke might already be with Daniel. She rushed to Luke's house, praying she wasn't too late. Chapter 8, The Final Confrontation. When Evie arrived at Luke's house, the door was slightly ajar. She drew her gun and entered cautiously, her eyes scanning the darkened rooms. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft creak of the floorboards under her feet. "Luke?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer. She moved through the house, every sense on high alert. When she reached the living room, she saw Luke, sitting on the couch, his face pale and his hands shaking. Across from him sat Daniel Hayes, a cruel smile on his lips. "Evie," Luke whispered, his voice filled with fear and confusion. He's been telling me things about my father, about Eleanor." "Daniel," Evie said, keeping her gun trained on him. "It's over. We know everything." Daniel's smile widened. Do you really know everything? Or have you just scratched the surface of what this town is hiding?" "You're the Mistwalker," Evie said, her voice steady. "You killed Eleanor, and now you're killing these women because they remind you of her." Daniel laughed, a low, bitter sound. "I didn't just kill her, detective. I loved her. And when she chose that worthless man over me, I had no choice. But these women, they were different. They were all a chance to make things right, to fix the mistake I made." "You're sick," Luke said, standing slowly, his hands clenched into fists. "You killed innocent women. You destroyed families. And for what? Some twisted sense of justice?" Daniel's eyes narrowed. "You don't understand, boy. None of you do. She was everything to me, and she was taken from me. You, of all people, should know what it's like to lose someone you love." Evie could see the madness in Daniel's eyes, the way he was gripping a knife in his hand. She had to end this before he hurt Luke or anyone else. "Drop the knife, Daniel," she ordered. "It's over." But Daniel only smiled, a cold, empty smile. "No, detective. It's just beginning." He lunged at Luke, the knife glinting in the dim light. Evie fired her gun, the sound deafening in the confined space. Daniel staggered, the knife slipping from his hand as he crumpled to the floor. Evie rushed to Luke, pulling him into a tight embrace. "Are you okay?" she whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. Luke nodded, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Yeah, I think so." They both looked down at Daniel, who was gasping for breath, a dark pool of blood spreading around him. His eyes were filled with pain, but also a strange sense of peace. "You'll never understand," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "She was everything." With that, Daniel Hayes, the Mistwalker, took his last breath. Epilogue. The town of Haven's Edge slowly began to heal after Daniel's death. The fear that had gripped the town started to dissipate, replaced by a cautious sense of relief. The killings had stopped, and the Mistwalker was no more. Evie and Luke were hailed as heroes for bringing the killer to justice, but the scars of the case ran deep. Luke struggled with the revelations about his family, and Evie found herself haunted by the faces of the victims, by the thought of how close they had come to losing everything. But through it all, their bond grew stronger. They found solace in each other, a shared understanding that went beyond words. What had started as a close partnership had evolved into something more, something neither of them could deny. One evening, as they walked along the cliffs where it all began, Evie looked out at the horizon, the setting sun casting a golden glow over the water. "It's over," she said softly, more to herself than to Luke. Luke stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the waves crashing against the rocks below. The wind tousled his hair, and he turned to Evie, his eyes reflecting the same mix of relief and lingering sorrow. "It is," he replied, though the weight of the past still hung heavy in his voice. "But it's hard to just move on, isn't it? After everything we've been through." Evie nodded, understanding all too well. "It's never easy. The things we've seen, the lives we've lost, they stay with us. But we can't let them consume us." She glanced at him, the fading sunlight highlighting the tension in his expression. "You know, you don't have to carry this alone, Luke. I'm here. Always." Luke turned to face her fully, a small, grateful smile forming on his lips. "I know, Evie. And that means more to me than I can put into words." For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, the sound of the ocean filling the space between them. Evie could feel the shift in the air, the unspoken emotions simmering just below the surface. Then, taking a deep breath, Luke reached out and took her hand in his. "Evie, there's something I need to say. Something I've wanted to say for a long time." Her heart skipped a beat, the closeness of the moment wrapping around her like a warm blanket. "What is it, Luke?" He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "We've been through so much together. And through it all, you've been my anchor, my strength. I don't know where I'd be without you." Evie felt her pulse quicken, her mind racing with possibilities. "Luke, Before she could finish, Luke gently squeezed her hand, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I love you, Evie," he said, his voice steady and sincere. "I think I've loved you for a long time. But I was afraid that if I said it, I'd lose you, or that it would change things between us." Evie felt a rush of emotion flood through her. She had always known there was something deeper between them, but hearing the words spoken aloud made it real, undeniable. Tears welled in her eyes, and she squeezed his hand back, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I love you too, Luke. More than I ever thought possible." Luke's smile widened, a look of relief and joy washing over him. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close as the last remnants of the day faded into twilight. For the first time in months, the tension in Evie's chest eased, replaced by a warmth that spread through her entire being. The darkness they had faced, the horrors they had witnessed, it all seemed to melt away in his embrace. As they stood together on the cliffs, the future no longer seemed as daunting. They had each other, and that was enough. They would face whatever came next, side by side, just as they always had. In the months that followed, Haven's Edge gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy. The townsfolk began to breathe easier, their lives no longer overshadowed by fear. The media frenzy surrounding the Mistwalker case subsided, and slowly, life moved forward. Evie and Luke continued to work together as partners, their bond only deepening as time passed. The spark between them, once unspoken, now burned brightly, adding a new layer to their relationship. They were still detectives, still dedicated to their work, but they had found something in each other that made the darkest days more bearable. One evening, as they sat in Evie's living room, a fire crackling in the fireplace, Luke leaned back on the couch, watching her as she sorted through old case files. "You know," he said, his tone casual, "I've been thinking, maybe we should take a break. Go somewhere, just the two of us. Get away from all this for a while." Evie looked up, surprised but intrigued. "A break? Like a vacation?" "Yeah," Luke said, smiling. "A real vacation. Somewhere with no murders, no case files, just peace." The idea was tempting, more than Evie cared to admit. She could already picture it, sunny days, quiet moments, just them and no distractions. "That sounds perfect," she said, her smile mirroring his. "Where do you want to go?" Luke thought for a moment, then shrugged. "Anywhere, as long as I'm with you." Evie chuckled, her heart lightened by the thought. "Then it's a plan." They spent the rest of the evening planning their getaway, a sense of excitement bubbling between them. For the first time in what felt like forever, the future seemed bright, full of promise and new beginnings. As the fire crackled and the night wore on, Evie and Luke sat together, their hands intertwined, their hearts at ease. The shadows of the past were finally beginning to fade, replaced by the light of something new, something worth holding on to. And in the warmth of that moment, they knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, united by the love that had grown between them in the midst of darkness. The end.
There was once a day that I would pray for you. I'd go and misbehave just so you'd notice too. Sneaking looks up and down from across the room. And damn, what a hell of a view. I feel good, you look great, I like you, I can't wait. A first time, a first date.